The road to my grandfather's cabin wasn't so much a road as it was a scar. It was a gash of gravel and dirt carved into the flank of the mountain, a defiant wound that nature was patiently, persistently trying to heal. Pine branches, heavy with the scent of resin and cold air, clawed at the sides of my rental SUV, their needles screeching against the glass like desperate fingernails. For the past hour, the only sign of human life had been the increasingly dilapidated asphalt surrendering to this gravel track, and now, even that was a memory. I was driving into a place that the world had agreed to forget, a fitting final resting place for the legacy of Dr. Alistair Finch. To the academic world, the name was a whisper, a cautionary tale told to graduate students. Don't pull a Finch. It meant don't get too brilliant too fast and then squander it all by chasing phantoms. Alistair was once a titan, a contemporary of the great minds of the mid-20th century. His work on quantum entanglement theory was foundational. Then came the divergence. He resigned his tenure, sold his patents for a pittance, and bought this lump of rock and timber in the middle of nowhere. He traded peer-reviewed journals for rambling, esoteric letters about local instabilities and geometrical acoustics. He traded the respect of his colleagues for the reputation of a crackpot. He traded his family for a hermitage. I never truly knew him. To me, he was a source of quiet shame, the reason I had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously in my own field. I am Dr. Leo Finch. I deal in data, in concrete, verifiable, repeatable results. I work with particle accelerators that cost billions of dollars to build, smashing fragments of reality together to understand its most fundamental rules. My world is one of sterile clean rooms, humming servers, and the elegant certainty of mathematics. Alistair's world, from what I could gather, had become one of dirt, superstition, and equations that started in genius and ended in gibberish. His lawyer's letter had been brief. Alistair had passed away. As his sole remaining kin, the property was now mine. My objective for this trip was equally brief. Locate and burn any remaining research, catalogue anything of actual value for auction, and sign the property over to a real estate agent who could hopefully sell it to some survivalist or off-the-grid enthusiast. I saw it as a final act of intellectual sanitation, a closing of a difficult chapter. The cabin finally emerged from the dense woods, and I felt a pang of something I refused to call pity. It was less a home and more of a scientific outpost that had gone feral. The structure was solid, built of thick, dark logs, but it was festooned with a bizarre array of technology in various states of decay. A rusted satellite dish, far too large for television, pointed silently at the forest floor. Thick insulated cables snaked from a weathered junction box into the ground itself, as if he were trying to power the very earth. And on the roof, a complex weather vane that looked more like an orrery, with interlocking brass rings and what looked like polished obsidian spheres, stood frozen against the grey sky. The inside was chaos, organized chaos. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, old paper, and something metallic and sharp, like a recently discharged capacitor. Every wall was a blackboard, and every blackboard was a tapestry of equations. I recognized the roots of his work, tensor calculus, wave function mechanics, but they spiraled outward into a syntax I'd never seen, incorporating geological symbols, astronomical charts, and recurring non-mathematical glyphs. This wasn't the work of a failing mind. It was the work of a mind that had created its own language to describe something it could no longer explain with ours. I set my own equipment case down on the only clear surface, a heavy oak table. My gear was my sanctuary, a ruggedized laptop, a portable spectrum analyzer, and a multifunction environmental sensor kit. State-of-the-art, calibrated to within an inch of its life. It was a tether to the real world, to the rules I knew. My grim task began. I started sorting through the papers, the blueprints, the schematics, and that's where I first found them. The rules. They weren't on a single neat list. They were embedded, like operational imperatives, within the scientific documents themselves. I was examining a complex schematic for a custom-built shortwave radio receiver, trying to understand the bizarre, fractal-like design of its antenna array. In the margin, scrawled in my grandfather's spidery handwriting, was the first one. 1. At Aero 313, the valley's resonant frequency shifts. Tune shortwave to 7.83 Hz. Do not attempt to modulate the signal, no matter what you hear. I scoffed. 7. 83 Hz is the fundamental frequency of the Schumann resonance, the so-called heartbeat of the Earth. It was a darling of New Age mystics and conspiracy theorists. To see it treated with such procedural gravity on a technically sophisticated blueprint was jarring. I tossed the schematic onto the to-burn pile. Later, while reviewing a detailed geological survey map of the property, I found another. It detailed the mineral composition of the rock strata with professional accuracy, but also noted strange magnetic anomalies. Taped to the bottom corner was a note. 3. If the lodgepole pines begin to grow in a spiral pattern, realign the 3 keystones in the garden to point toward the southern peak. Local geometric calibration is vital. Geometric calibration? He was writing as if the very geometry of his land was a variable that needed occasional maintenance. It was pure, unadulterated nonsense. I felt a surge of anger, a frustration at the sheer waste of his intellect. I worked for hours, the burn pile growing steadily. It was filled with genius and madness intertwined, star charts of constellations that didn't exist, acoustic analyses of the wind, theoretical papers on the permeability of local spacetime. Finally, I found a hydrographic chart of the stream that ran a few dozen yards from the cabin. It was meticulously detailed, mapping the flow rates and mineral content, and there, next to a series of temperature readings, was the rule that would eventually unravel me. 2. Never measure the stream's temperature with a digital thermometer. Use only the mercury instrument. The digital readings are persuasive. Persuasive. What in God's name did that mean? I looked up and saw it. An old mercury and glass thermometer hanging from a nail on the wall. It was a museum piece. My own environmental sensor was a marvel of modern engineering. Its thermistor was sensitive to 1/1000th of a degree, its readings instantaneous, and logged to a microsecond timestamp. The idea that this analog relic could be superior was laughable. It was the final pathetic insult to a life of scientific reason. That was it. I needed a break. I needed to do something methodical, something real. A force of professional habit took over. Before undertaking any serious work in a new environment, you take baseline readings. I grabbed my sensor kit. I would map the cabin's electromagnetic field, take an air quality sample, and yes, I would get a precise temperature reading from that stream. I would do it with my multi-$1,000, perfectly calibrated digital instrument. It felt like a small act of defiance against the ghost of his delusion. The air outside was cold and sharp, biting at my exposed skin. The stream was just as the chart had described it, clear, fast-moving, gurgling over a bed of smooth grey stones. It was the picture of mundane terrestrial nature. I knelt at the bank, unclipped the thermal probe from my sensor unit, and submerged its metallic tip into the rushing water. The main unit screen lit up. I watched the numbers settle. 4.721 degrees Celsius, 4.720 degrees C, 4.719 degrees C. Perfectly normal. Cold, clean mountain water. I held it there for a full minute, letting the sensor gather a stable data set. My breath plumed in the air. The only sounds were the stream and the wind sighing through the pines. Everything was as it should be. The world was obeying its laws. I was about to pull the probe out when the display flickered. It was for less than a heartbeat. A single, almost imperceptible refresh of the screen. I assumed it was a trick of the light, a stray reflection of the sun peeking through the canopy. But a part of my brain, the part trained to notice infinitesimal anomalies in oceans of data, snagged on it. I tapped the screen, navigating to the data log. The sensor records every reading, time-stamped to the millisecond. I scrolled back through the last minute of data. 4.719, 4.719, 4.718. Then I saw it. One single data point, one entry in a sea of normalcy. Timestamp 14/32/07/112. Reading 0.273 K. I stared. I read it again, and again. The K stood for Kelvin, the absolute scale of temperature. Zero's Kelvin, absolute zero, is the theoretical point at which all atomic motion ceases. It is the coldest possible temperature in the universe, a fundamental limit imposed by the laws of thermodynamics. Reaching it is a practical impossibility, and going below it is a physical one. It's not just difficult, it's a violation of the very definition of temperature. And my sensor, for 1,000th of a second, had logged a reading of -0.273 Kelvin. My first thought was immediate and dismissive: catastrophic sensor failure. A voltage spike, a software bug, a random cosmic ray hitting the processor at just the wrong moment. It had to be. It was the only rational explanation. Annoyed, I submerged the probe again, my eyes glued to the screen. 4.715 degrees C, stable, solid, completely and utterly normal. I held it for 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. The anomalous reading was gone, a ghost in the machine, but the log entry was still there, a digital monument to an impossible event. I spent the rest of the afternoon and the entire night in that cabin, and I wasn't sorting papers. My mission of intellectual sanitation was forgotten, replaced by a frantic, obsessive need to debunk a single line of data. I ran every diagnostic the sensor kit had. I checked the firmware. I recalibrated the probe against 3 separate control standards. I tested the battery's voltage output for fluctuations. I even wrote a custom script to flood the processor with junk data, trying to force a similar error. The results came back, one after another, each one a nail in the coffin of my certainty. Power supply, stable. Firmware, latest version, no errors. Probe calibration, perfect. Processor stress test, passed. The equipment was flawless. The machine had not made a mistake. As the first weak light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows of the lab cabin, I sat slumped at the oak table, staring at my laptop screen. The single line of impossible data was displayed in the center, glowing in the dim light. I had eliminated every variable. The hardware, the software, the power source, the user, all were functioning as expected. A cold dread, colder than any mountain stream, began to pool in my stomach. In science, when you have eliminated all impossibilities, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I had eliminated every possibility of instrument error. All that was left was the measurement itself. The world outside my grandfather's cabin had, for a fraction of a second, broken the most fundamental rule of its own existence. The rule on the chart echoed in my head, no longer sounding like the ravings of a madman, but like a desperate warning. The digital readings are persuasive. My grandfather hadn't feared that the digital thermometers were inaccurate. He feared they were too accurate. He knew they were fast enough to catch the moments when reality flickered, when the universe forgot its own rules. He wasn't documenting his own descent into madness. He was documenting a world that was coming apart at the seams, and I, with all my modern certainty and arrogant skepticism, had just accidentally recorded one of its tremors. My initial mission was in ashes. Burning his research now seemed like an act of profound ignorance. I had to understand. I had to know why. That impossible number on my screen wasn't an error. It was an invitation into my grandfather's world, a world where the laws of physics were apparently negotiable. If you want to follow me down this rabbit hole to see what other impossible truths are hiding in these mountains, make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button. Because I'm not leaving this place until I have answers, or until the answers find me. Sleep was no longer a state of rest, but a surrender I couldn't afford. The single, impossible line of data from my sensor had become the focal point of my entire existence. It was a gravitational singularity, pulling all my training, my skepticism, and my understanding of the cosmos into a single, infinitely dense point of terror. The world I had inhabited for 34 years felt like a thin sheet of ice, and I had just witnessed the first crack spread across its surface. The burn pile was a monument to my former arrogance. I rescued every scrap of paper from it, handling the brittle yellowed sheets with the reverence of a scribe discovering a lost gospel. The cabin was no longer Alistair's tomb of madness. It was a research archive, the most important one on the planet. My mission had inverted. I was no longer here to erase a legacy, but to desperately, frantically try to understand it. I spread the documents across the vast oak table, the floor, any available surface. My own state-of-the-art equipment sat nearby, its clean lines and quiet hum a stark contrast to the chaotic genius surrounding it. It was a tool of the old world, and I was now an unwilling immigrant in the new. I began to work not as a nephew clearing an estate, but as a physicist confronting an unknown phenomenon. I started to categorize, to triage the information. I separated the purely mathematical treatises from the geological surveys, the astronomical charts from the technical schematics. A pattern began to emerge from the chaos. There was a clear correlation between different domains. A note about a magnetic anomaly in the western ridge would be cross-referenced on a star chart with a glyph next to an obscure red dwarf. A complex equation describing wave propagation through crystalline structures would be linked to a note about the acoustic properties of the streambed. My grandfather wasn't studying a dozen different unrelated fields. He was studying one thing, a single unified system. This valley, he treated it like a vast, complex machine, and these documents were its operating manual, and more disturbingly, its repair log. My eyes kept drifting to the schematic that had started it all, the one for the custom-built shortwave radio. The rule scrawled in its margin felt less like a suggestion and more like an appointment. 1. At 0313, the valley's resonant frequency shifts. Tune shortwave to 7.838. Do not attempt to modulate the signal, no matter what you hear. I found the device in a corner tucked under a heavy canvas sheet. It was beautiful in a terrifyingly functional way. It was clearly handmade, but with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. The chassis was copper, but it wasn't polished. It was covered in a fine lacework of etched geometric patterns, like a circuit board designed by a druid. The main tuning dial was not plastic or bakelite, but a heavy, polished disc of granite, with markings that didn't correspond to any standard radio frequencies. But hooked up to my own spectrum analyzer, I saw that its range was immense, capable of dipping far into the extremely low frequency ELF bands. The antenna, which he had routed through a ceramic insulator in the window frame, was a fractal lattice of copper wire, a Menger sponge design that mathematically had an infinite surface area in a finite volume. It was designed to listen to everything, everywhere, all at once. The power source was the most unsettling part. It wasn't plugged into the wall, it was wired directly into one of the thick insulated cables that I'd seen leading into the ground. He had been powering it with the earth itself, tapping into some telluric current that pulsed beneath the mountain. I spent the day preparing. I set up my own recording equipment, wanting to capture and analyze whatever this signal was. I cross-referenced the 7.83 Hz frequency, the Schumann resonance. In my world, it was a faint planetary hum, the result of lightning discharges trapped in the Earth's ionospheric cavity. It was geophysical background noise. To Alistair, it was clearly a carrier wave for something else entirely. As night fell, the oppressive silence of the mountains returned, but now it felt different. It wasn't empty. It was listening. The forest was no longer a collection of trees. It was the housing for a vast unseen mechanism. The wind whistling through the eaves wasn't just moving air, it was a pressure differential in a system I was only just beginning to perceive. The hours ticked by. 01 now. 02, co. 03, co. I sat before my grandfather's radio, my hand resting on the cold granite of the tuning dial. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic biological rhythm against the cold cosmic precision of the coming moment. My laptop was recording. My spectrum analyzer was active, its waterfall display showing the gentle ambient noise of the radio spectrum. 0312. I took a deep breath. My fingers felt clumsy, thick. 0313. I turned the dial. The mechanism moved with a smooth, weighted click. The speakers, which had been silent, hissed to life. It wasn't the clean hiss of an untuned radio. It was a thick, wet, organic sound, like rain on dry leaves, and underneath it, a deep, resonant hum began to build. 783 Hz. The analyzer confirmed it. A perfect, clean sine wave, the Earth's heartbeat. For a moment, that was all there was. The hiss and the hum. I felt a wave of anticlimax, a fleeting hope that this was all just the product of a brilliant mind's decay. Then the hiss began to change. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't music. It was the static itself that was gaining structure. As a physicist who has worked with radio telescopes, I know the sound of the universe. I know the faint, omnipresent hiss of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the CMB. It's the afterglow of the Big Bang, the oldest light in existence, a faint signal that permeates all of space. It is the closest thing we have to the sound of creation itself. And that's what I was hearing. But it was wrong. It was corrupted, damaged, like a pristine audio file that has been compressed and decompressed too many times, filled with digital artifacts and glitches. I could hear packets of noise that seemed to drop out into sudden, terrifying silence before returning. I could hear patterns, repeating sequences of pops and crackles that were too ordered to be random. It was the sound of a signal degrading. It was the sound of information being lost. I stared at my spectrum analyzer, and the dread that had been pooling in my gut turned into a frozen monolith of horror. The waterfall display, which should have shown a smooth, even distribution of energy for the CMB, was riddled with holes. There were sharp geometric gaps in the signal, moments and frequencies where the background radiation of the universe simply wasn't there. And around the edges of these gaps, the signal flared with unnatural intensity, like the universe was trying and failing to heal these wounds in its own primordial memory. This wasn't a local phenomenon. The CMB is everywhere. To hear it corrupted meant that the corruption was everywhere too. This valley, for some reason, wasn't the source of the problem. It was an amplifier, a place where the background noise of universal decay was loud enough to be heard on a handmade radio powered by the ground. Alistair's words echoed in my mind. Do not attempt to modulate the signal. I now understood why. He wasn't afraid of what he might hear. He was afraid of what might hear him. To interact with this signal, to impose your own order upon it, would be like shouting in a library where the librarians were ancient, unseen things that did not tolerate disturbances. The transmission lasted for exactly 11 minutes. At 03:24, the structured static collapsed back into a simple hiss, and the deep hum faded away. The appointment was over. I sat back in my chair, drenched in a cold sweat, my mind reeling from the sheer scale of the implication. The universe wasn't a finely tuned clockwork mechanism. It was a failing machine, a great cosmic engine that was slowly, inexorably breaking down. The laws of physics I had built my life upon weren't immutable truths carved in stone. They were the operating parameters of a system that was becoming increasingly unstable, and I had just been listening to its error log. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless, caffeine-fueled obsession. The impossible temperature reading and the corrupted CMB signal were my Rosetta Stone. I returned to Alistair's notes, but now I had the key to their language. The strange glyphs were notations for specific types of signal corruption. The bizarre equations were attempts to predict the topological defects, the holes, in the CMB. The geological surveys were maps of how these cosmic flaws manifested locally, causing physical reality itself to warp and buckle. The rule about the spiraling pines suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. Chirality, the handedness of molecules, is a fundamental property of life. A sudden shift in the growth patterns of an entire forest would imply a temporary change in the electromagnetic force, a glitch in one of the universe's most basic operating principles. Calibrating the geometry with the keystones wasn't superstition. It was a desperate attempt to create a localized field to counteract the instability, to force the broken code back into its proper syntax. My own perception of the world began to warp. I could no longer look at anything without seeing the potential for failure. A shimmer of heat haze over the rocks wasn't just heat haze. It was a potential fluctuation in the refractive index of light. The creak of the cabin's timbers at night wasn't just the wood settling. It was a momentary weakness in the strong nuclear force that held its atoms together. The horror was no longer about a monster hiding in the woods. The monster was the woods. It was the rocks, the air, the light from the sun. The monster was reality itself, and its defining characteristic was its own impending failure. I was trapped, not in a cabin but in a crumbling framework of existence. The isolation was absolute. Who could I tell? What could I say? Hello, colleagues. I have definitive proof that our universe is suffering from bit rot. I would be stripped of my credentials and locked in a padded room before I could finish the sentence. I am alone with this knowledge. Alistair was alone with it, and it is a knowledge that scours the soul. It redefines existence as a temporary state, a brief period of coherence in an eternal sea of decay and chaos. Late on the third night after the radio transmission, I found a hidden compartment in the base of the oak table. Inside was a single, heavy, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't filled with equations or charts. It was a journal. And the first entry, in my grandfather's familiar script, sent a new wave of terror through me because it suggested the final, unthinkable piece of the puzzle. It suggested that the decay was not random. The entry read, "The corruption is not a passive process. The signal loss is a symptom of something else. It is the sound of something feeding. Where reality thins, they listen. Where it breaks, they look through." The final sentence in my grandfather's journal was not an ending. It was a declaration of war. A war Alistair had apparently been fighting alone for decades. A war against an enemy so fundamental, it defied definition. Where it breaks, they look through. The pronoun hung in the silent cabin air, freighted with an implication my mind recoiled from. They, a plural, an intelligence, a malevolent audience to the slow, agonizing heat death of our universe. The knowledge changed the texture of my fear. The abstract horror of a failing system, as vast and impersonal as the cosmos itself, was replaced by something sharp, specific, and predatory. The universe wasn't just dying of natural causes. It was being stalked. The glitches weren't random system errors, they were bite marks. My methodical scientific mind, which had just begun to grapple with the concept of a flawed reality, was now forced to accommodate an even more poisonous idea: sentient entropy. My behavior in the following days became a frantic parody of the scientific method. I was no longer just an observer, I was a sentry. I set up my own equipment to monitor the cabin and its surroundings constantly. Sensors, cameras, audio recorders, a web of digital senses to augment my own, which I no longer trusted. I needed data. I needed to quantify the enemy. If something was looking through, I wanted to see its shadow on the wall. The glitches, once subtle and rare, began to escalate. They were becoming more frequent, more audacious. One morning, I was making coffee, a mundane ritual to anchor myself to a world I once knew. I placed the kettle on the small electric stove and turned my back to get a mug. I heard the click of the heating element, the faint hum of electricity. When I turned back, the kettle was floating a perfect 6 inches above the heating coil, its base shimmering with a heat that had no physical source. It hung there for 3 full seconds, a silent, blatant refutation of gravity, before clattering back down onto the stove with a deafening clang. I didn't scream, I filmed it. I logged it. Event G01, localized gravitational anomaly. Another time I was walking the perimeter of the cabin, checking the strange telluric current wires my grandfather had buried. I watched a pine cone drop from a high branch. It fell, as all things do, accelerating at 9.8 meters per second squared. But the sound of it hitting the soft bed of pine needles reached my ears a full second before it actually struck the ground. I watched it land in utter silence. Event C02, causality violation. My brain struggled to process the sensory input, a profound cognitive dissonance that left me nauseous and dizzy. The most disturbing manifestation was the pines. I remembered the third rule, the one about the spiraling growth patterns. Over the course of a single afternoon, I watched it happen. The lodgepole pines at the northern edge of the property, trees that had grown straight and true for a century, began to subtly twist. It was imperceptible moment to moment, but by dusk, their trunks had a distinct helical warp, as if the very space they occupied had been wrung out like a wet towel. The fundamental chirality of their biological structure had been edited. I rushed to the keystones in the garden, 3 black basalt pillars covered in Alistair's strange glyphs. Following the diagram in his notes, I heaved and pivoted them, realigning their pointed tops with the southern peak, which now seemed to shimmer with a faint, oily light. As I locked the final stone in place, I felt a deep, subvocal hum resonate through the soles of my boots, and the twisting of the trees seemed to halt. I had not performed a ritual. I had executed a command. I had run a patch on a corrupted piece of local code. These events, as terrifying as they were, provided a crucial insight. The phenomena were not uniform, they were concentrated. This valley wasn't just an amplifier, it was a nexus. There was a focal point, a place where the barrier between our reality and the outside was at its thinnest, a wound. And if I could find it, I might be able to understand the nature of the infection. My grandfather's maps became my new scripture. I cross-referenced everything. The geological surveys showing magnetic anomalies, the hydrographic charts with their thermal inconsistencies, the acoustic analyses that mapped strange, silent zones in the forest. When I overlaid them, a single point of convergence emerged, a place where every bizarre reading and inexplicable event intersected. It was a cave system high up on the western ridge, marked on Alistair's primary map with a single, stark glyph, a spiral turning inward on itself. The hike to the ridge was an exercise in paranoia. Every rustle of leaves was a potential decoherence event. Every strange shadow was a trick of warped light. The world felt thin, unreal, like a projection on a faulty screen. The air grew colder as I ascended, and I noticed a strange metallic tang to it, like the scent of ozone that clung to Alistair's radio. The entrance to the cave was not obvious. It was hidden behind a curtain of ancient moss-covered rockfall, a place you would never find unless you knew precisely where to look. The air that breathed from the entrance was not just cold, it was unnaturally still and carried a faint, high-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. This was the source of the magnetic anomaly. I switched on my headlamp, its powerful LED beam cutting a clean white cone into the absolute darkness. I stepped inside. For the first 20 yards it was just a cave. Damp rock, the drip of water, the scuttling of some unseen thing. Then, the geometry of the place began to fail. The clean, straight beam of my headlamp started to bend. I watched the cone of light curve gently to the left, illuminating a wall that, by all rights, should have been behind me. The floor, which looked flat, felt as though it were tilted at a steep angle, forcing me to brace myself against the wall to keep from falling sideways. It was a place where Euclidean geometry had been repealed. The angles were wrong. The distances were deceptive. It was a physical manifestation of the corrupted CMB signal, a place filled with holes and impossible turns. Deeper within, the hum grew louder, resolving itself into the same structured, artifact-ridden static I had heard on the radio. It was coming not through my ears, but directly into my skull, a resonant vibration that seemed to shake the very atoms of my being. The air grew thick with a visible energy, a faint violet ionization that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And then I saw it. The heart of the Nexus. The cavern opened into a vast, spherical chamber. It was unnervingly perfect, too smooth to be natural. And in the exact center, suspended in the air by no visible means, was a crystal. It was perhaps 10 feet in diameter, a massive, multifaceted object of a substance I could not identify. It was not quartz or diamond. It was a smoky, semi-translucent material that seemed to swallow the light from my headlamp. It pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the 7.3 Hz hum of the Earth. Faint, ethereal light forms, like trapped lightning, arced across its surface and through its core. Etched onto its countless facets were the equations, my grandfather's equations, the ones from the blackboards, the schematics, the journal. They were carved into the very structure of the crystal, glowing with a faint blue light. I realized with a staggering, mind-breaking certainty what I was looking at. This was not a geological formation. This was a device. This was the valley's source code, the central processor that ran the simulation of our local reality. This was the stabilizer, and it was damaged. A great, dark fracture ran through its core, a spiderweb of black lines that did not reflect light but seemed to absorb it. From this fracture, The violet ionization leaked, and the hum of corrupted static was at its most intense. This was the wound. This was the source of the glitches, the gravitational anomalies, the temporal distortions. The hardware was failing. I approached it, drawn by a horrified fascination. As I got closer, I could see through the crystal. Its facets did not reflect the cavern around me. They acted as windows into somewhere else. And in those windows, I saw them, the observers. My mind, a human mind built to process a three-dimensional world governed by consistent physics, struggled to resolve what I was seeing. I did not see creatures of flesh and bone. I saw beings of pure, malevolent mathematics. They were shapes of impossible geometry, things with too many dimensions, folding and unfolding in on themselves. They were colors my eyes were not equipped to see, a screaming palette of anti-light and unseen wavelengths. They were intelligent patterns in the static, sentient glitches in the code. They were not in the crystal. The crystal was a lens. They were on the other side, in the void between realities, the chaotic medium my grandfather had written about. And they were pressed up against the glass, their attention focused on the fracture, on the thin, fragile membrane of our existence. They were the source of the feeding sound. They were consuming the order, the information, the very structure of our universe as it leaked through the crack. They were sipping at the edges of our reality like carrion birds at a dying animal. One of them noticed me. A great shifting vortex of geometric wrongness turned its attention from the fracture to the facet that showed my reflection. I felt its gaze not with my eyes, but as a direct intellectual pressure inside my skull. It was a feeling of being analyzed, passed, and dismissed, all in the same horrifying instant. The knowledge it projected into my mind was not in any language, but it was clear. It saw me as a complex but ultimately trivial piece of data in a system it was dismantling. My existence was a line of code in a program it was in the process of deleting. The pressure intensified. The world around me, the cave, the crystal, began to flicker. The static in my head screamed, and for a moment I saw the world as they did, a shimmering, unstable hologram of mathematical probabilities, and I, a fragile, temporary confluence of loosely bound quantum states. I broke. I scrambled backward, falling over the uneven floor, my headlamp beam skittering wildly across the impossible angles of the cavern. I turned and ran. I fled from the hum, from the pressure, from the sight of those things that wore geometry as their skin. I did not stop until I burst back out into the cold mountain air, gasping and sobbing, my body shaking uncontrollably. I lay on the rocks outside the cave entrance for what could have been hours, the mundane reality of the sun on my face and the wind in the pines a pathetic balm on my shattered psyche. I had found the source. I had looked through the crack in the wall of the world and seen the things that lived on the other side. My grandfather hadn't been a madman. He had been a soldier, a lone engineer desperately trying to patch a failing supercomputer while cosmic horrors clawed at the firewalls. The rules were not superstitions, they were defense protocols. The radio was a warning system. The keystones were a shield generator. He hadn't been studying the failure of the universe. He had been fighting for its survival, and now he was gone. And I, his arrogant, ignorant grandson, was the only one left who knew. The only one who understood the true nature of the static between the stars. It is the sound of them, chewing at the edges of our world, and I now knew that they had seen me. I had been noticed, and that, I feared, was a far greater violation of the rules than my grandfather could have ever imagined. The flight from the cave was not a journey through space, but a fall through the layers of my own sanity. I arrived back at the cabin as a different entity than the one who had left. The arrogant physicist, the skeptical nephew, the methodical researcher, all had been flayed alive and left behind on that ridge, their psychic skins abandoned next to the entrance of a cave that bent the light. What returned was a raw nerve, a man who had stared into the machinery of the cosmos and seen the name of its disease. The observers. My first actions were not rational, they were primal. I slammed the heavy oak door and threw the bolt, a gesture of pathetic, symbolic defiance against an enemy that treated space-time as a permeable membrane. I dragged the massive oak table against the door, my muscles screaming in protest. I covered the windows not with curtains but with blackboards, frantically stapling Alistair's chaotic tapestries of equations over the glass, as if their arcane logic could somehow ward off the things I had seen. The cabin was no longer a research station. It was my bunker, my asylum. The following days bled into one another, a seamless smear of terror and caffeine. My world had shrunk to the four walls of this log and timber prison, and my life had contracted to a single, obsessive purpose: to understand the war my grandfather had been fighting. I no longer studied his notes as an academic exercise. I studied them as a soldier studies the memoirs of a decorated general, searching for strategy, for tactics, for a single sliver of hope in a battle I had unknowingly inherited. The feeling of being watched was no longer a paranoid delusion. It was a physical constant. It was a low-grade pressure at the base of my skull, a faint peripheral shimmer in my vision where straight lines seemed to momentarily curve. I would catch myself staring at the corner of the room, convinced that the 90-degree angle was wrong, that for a split second it had become 89.9 degrees. I had brought the cave's non-Euclidean poison back with me. The ghosts of impossible geometry now haunted my perception. I abandoned my own elegant, modern equipment. It felt like bringing a perfectly crafted slide rule to a gunfight. My grandfather's handmade devices were the only things that mattered now. They were not built to measure a stable world, but to interface with a failing one. His radio, his telluric current sensors, his bizarre orrery on the roof, these were the weapons, the shields, the communication arrays. As I delved deeper into the final set of Alistair's notebooks, the ones from his last years, the language became more desperate. The elegant equations were often broken by frantic, scrawled sentences. The resonance is weakening. Had to recalibrate the geometric field twice this week. The decay is accelerating. They are becoming more persistent. They learn the patches. He wasn't just maintaining the system anymore, he was losing. Amidst this desperation, I found a recurring reference to something he called the archive. It was never explicitly defined, but it was mentioned with a kind of finality, as a last resort or a final testament. The notes pointed toward a specific piece of hardware I had previously dismissed as junk. An old custom-built server rack bolted to the floor in a lead-lined closet. It was a Frankenstein's monster of outdated computer parts and inexplicable crystalline components that hummed with a low internal energy. It was connected to the same telluric power grid as the radio, but it was offline, dead. I spent an entire day trying to power it up, but it was useless. There was no conventional power switch, no interface. Then I discovered it wasn't meant to be powered on. It was meant to be unlocked. There was a small, unassuming terminal with a black screen and a single blinking cursor. Below it, a simple prompt: enter foundational impossibility constant. A password prompt. But what a password? A foundational impossibility constant. My mind raced through the candidates. Pi, an irrational number, but not an impossibility. The square root of -1, an imaginary number, foundational to quantum mechanics but a well-defined concept. I tried Planck's constant, the speed of light, the gravitational constant. Each entry was met with the same silent, blinking cursor. I felt a surge of despair. This was it. The archive was Alistair's final message, his "in case of my death" file, and it was locked behind a riddle I couldn't solve. I slumped back, my head in my hands, the static of the valley seeming to press in on me. What impossibility had he discovered that was so fundamental, so constant, that he would use it as the ultimate key? My gaze fell upon my own laptop, its screen still displaying the log from my environmental sensor. It was the data from that first day, the day my world had cracked open, and I saw it, the line that had started it all. Timestamp 14/32/07/112. Reading 0.273 K. A foundational impossibility. A temperature below the absolute end of temperature. A number that could not exist. But it did. I had measured it. It wasn't a universal constant. It was a local one. A constant of this valley's sickness. With a trembling hand, I leaned forward and typed the number into the terminal. 0.273, I hit enter. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a low groan, the server rack whirred to life. Lights flickered on within its chassis, illuminating the pulsing crystals. A fan began to spin. On the terminal screen, a progress bar appeared, and a single file began to decompress. Finch Final Protocol MP4. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I connected the terminal to my laptop and transferred the file. I clicked play. The face that appeared on my screen was both familiar and that of a stranger. It was Alistair, but he was older than any photo I had ever seen, his face a roadmap of exhaustion and profound sorrow. His brilliant eyes, the ones I had seen in his university portraits, were hollowed out, haunted by things they should never have seen. He was in the cabin, sitting at the same oak table where I now sat. "Hello," he began, his voice a dry rasp, heavy with the weight of unshared burdens. "If you are seeing this, then I am dead. More than that, if you have managed to unlock this archive, it means you have seen it for yourself. You have recorded a null state event. You have witnessed a moment when the code failed, and you have my deepest, most sincere condolences." He took a shaky breath and looked directly into the camera, and it felt as though he were looking directly into my soul. "I will not waste time," he said. "You have questions. There is only one central answer, and from it all other terrible truths proceed. Our universe, Leo, it's not real, not in the way we think of as real. It's a simulation, a sandbox." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. A simulation, not a failing natural system, but an artificial one. "I believe," he continued, his voice gaining a bit of its old professorial cadence, "that it was created by an intelligence we can't possibly conceive of, as a kind of test bed, an environment in which to model the viability of a specific set of physical laws, our laws. The strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, gravity, thermodynamics, they aren't fundamental truths. They are parameters, settings in a cosmic experiment." He gestured vaguely at the cabin around him. The experiment, however, was abandoned eons ago. The creators, the programmers, whatever they were, they moved on. They left the server running, and like any complex program left to run for an eternity without maintenance, it is suffering from data degradation. Bit rot, on a cosmological scale. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "That is the source of the glitches. The corrupted signal of the cosmic microwave background isn't the echo of our creation. It's the garbled header file of our entire reality. The system is slowly, gracefully crashing." My mind reeled. The floating kettle, the causality violation, the spiraling pines, all of it. Bugs in the software. "But the decay is not the greatest threat," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The true danger comes from outside, from beyond the firewall. You have seen them. I know you have. The observers. They are not from another universe. They are from whatever reality lies outside this simulation. Think of them as extra-dimensional malware, rogue programs, viruses from the master operating system. Our degrading code, our thinning reality, creates vulnerabilities, security holes. And they are drawn to these holes. They are predators that feed on information, on order, on the very logic that holds our existence together. They are not just watching the system crash. They are accelerating it. They are consuming it." He finally explained the valley. It wasn't just a random weak point. "This place," he said, "is special. I believe it is a point of privileged access, a developer's console, a debug terminal. The underlying code of the simulation is closer to the surface here. That is why the glitches are so pronounced. It is also why they can be influenced. The keystones, the radio, the crystal, they weren't just patches, they were admin commands. Alistair hadn't just been a watchman, he had been the system's last, unauthorized administrator." The video ended with a look of utter defeat on his face. "I have spent 40 years of my life here, Leo. 40 years fighting a losing battle, pushing back against the inevitable tide of chaos, patching a program whose source code is unraveling. I have held it back, but my patches are failing. The hardware, the core stabilizer in the ridge, it's critically damaged. The fracture you've seen is not stable, it's growing." He looked away from the camera at something beyond the frame, and a new, more immediate terror entered his eyes. "A cascade failure is imminent. The system is approaching a fatal exception error. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I've done the math, I've run the projections, and I am so sorry. The screen went black. I sat there in the humming silence of the cabin, the empty screen reflected in my wide, unblinking eyes. The final piece of the puzzle had not brought clarity. It had brought annihilation. My science, my life's work, my entire species, everything I had ever known, loved, or studied was a fiction, a ghost, a line of code in an abandoned computer program. I was not a being of matter and energy, a product of billions of years of cosmic evolution. I was an NPC in a game that had been left on for too long. The psychological collapse was total. It began as a low chuckle, a bubble of insane laughter at the sheer cosmic absurdity of it all. The laughter grew, becoming a hysterical, broken thing that echoed in the lonely cabin. It was the sound of a mind that had been stretched past its breaking point, a mind that had been shown the utter, final meaninglessness of its own existence. The laughter finally broke, collapsing into ragged, gut-wrenching sobs. I was not a prisoner in a cabin. I was a prisoner in a line of code. My jailer wasn't a monster. It was a set of abandoned physical parameters. And the ultimate horror was not that we were alone in the universe. It was that we weren't. We were a forgotten file on a decaying hard drive, and something from the outside was now trying to delete it. The aftermath of my grandfather's revelation was not a storm. It was a vacuum. The hysterical laughter and the gut-wrenching sobs had scoured me clean, leaving behind the sterile, silent void of absolute nihilism. My existence, my memories, my entire scientific discipline, all were phantom limbs, the twitching recollections of a body that was never truly there. I was a ghost, haunting the machine, and the machine was dying. For an unknowable stretch of time, I did nothing. I sat at the oak table in the deepening gloom of the cabin, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of light piercing the blackboards on the windows. Each mote was a universe of complexity, a ballet of Brownian motion governed by laws that were nothing more than a developer's forgotten whim. The sight was no longer beautiful, it was pathetic. A puppet show performing for an empty theater. The change began not as a sound but as a feeling, a deep resonant lurch in the very foundation of the world. It was not the familiar shudder of an earthquake, which moves through a stable medium. This was the medium itself recoiling. The floor beneath me didn't shake, it seemed to momentarily lose its property of solidity. For a single stomach-dropping instant, I felt a sensation of infinite falling, as if the cabin and the mountain and the entire planet had been deleted from their coordinates in space-time. Then the sound hit. It was a groan, a low, tectonic tearing, but the acoustics were wrong. The sound seemed to come from inside my own head, and from the edge of the solar system simultaneously. The cabin's timbers screamed, not with the clean stress of tortured wood, but with the discordant digital shriek of a corrupted audio file. I looked at the heavy oak table I had wedged against the door, and for a terrifying second, its texture flickered. The deep, rich grain of the wood was replaced by a smooth, featureless, low-resolution texture, like a piece of unfinished computer graphics, before snapping back into focus. The cascade failure had begun. Hallister's fatal exception error was no longer a future projection. It was here. A new energy surged through my hollowed-out shell, an energy born not of hope, but of pure, mechanistic desperation. My life might be a lie, but the terror was real. The pain of being unmade was real. I was a program that did not want to be shut down. My objective was singular, stripped of all emotional complexity. Get to the cave. Get to the core processor. I had to see the extent of the damage. I threw the bolt on the door and shoved the table aside. The world I stepped into was a masterpiece of surrealist horror. The air was thick with the violet ionization I had seen in the cave, and the sky was no longer a uniform blue. It was a flickering, pixelated canvas, with patches that momentarily displayed the star-dusted black of deep space or a searing magenta nothingness I had no name for. The forest was in the throes of a catastrophic systems crash. The path to the ridge was a treacherous, shifting thing. The ground beneath my feet would sometimes lose its friction, becoming as slick as oiled glass, while other patches would become preternaturally solid. their gravity increasing so that each step was a monumental effort. Trees, those stoic pillars of reality, were now the system's most obvious rendering errors. A mighty Douglas fir would flicker out of existence for a second, leaving a tree-shaped hole in the world, then reappear. The chirping of birds was a stuttering broken loop, often playing in reverse. I saw a deer phase through a boulder, its body a translucent shimmer of confused data, its eyes wide with an animal terror that transcended the mere fear of predators. It was afraid of the world itself. The observers were no longer just watching from the outside. The thinning veil allowed their influence to bleed through in more tangible ways. They did not manifest as physical beings, they manifested as violations. I saw my own shadow detach from my feet and stretch out at an impossible angle, its form twisting into a multi-limbed geometric monstrosity before snapping back into place. Pockets of the air would suddenly shimmer and resolve into the complex non-Euclidean shapes I had seen in the crystal, static-filled voids that exuded a palpable aura of anti-logic. To look at them was to feel the circuits of my own brain try to pass an unsolvable equation. The journey, which had taken an hour before, took 3. It was a grueling trek through the wreckage of physics. I finally reached the hidden entrance to the cave, my body bruised, my mind afraid not of sensory overload. The hum emanating from within was no longer a subtle vibration. It was a deafening, soul-shaking roar. The very rock around the entrance seemed to be vibrating into dust. I plunged into the darkness, and it was 1,000 times worse than before. The non-Euclidean architecture was no longer a subtle distortion. It was a chaotic, churning maelstrom. The corridor twisted and folded in on itself like a protein misfolding. I had to crawl, pulling myself along a floor that was sometimes a wall and sometimes a ceiling, the beam of my headlamp bending and splitting into fractal patterns. I finally tumbled into the central chamber, and the sight stole the breath from my lungs. The great crystal, the valley's source code, was dying. The fracture that had run through its core was now a gaping black chasm. It was no longer leaking energy, it was hemorrhaging it. Pulses of raw, unstructured data, the violet lightning, erupted from the wound, striking the cavern walls and causing them to dissolve into shimmering clouds of pixels. The beautiful ordered equations carved into its facets were flickering and corrupting, the elegant syntax of reality dissolving into gibberish. And the windows were wide open. Through the crystal's facets, the realm of the observers was no longer a distant view. It was pressing in, a riot of impossible color and cancerous geometry. The static was the sound of their proximity, their collective, hungry consciousness focused on this single beautiful point of failure. The pressure in my skull was immense, a physical weight that threatened to crush my consciousness into a singularity. They were no longer just sipping at the edges. They were tearing the system apart to get inside. In that moment, I understood the finality of it all. This was not a recoverable error. This was a core meltdown. The simulation was seconds, maybe minutes, from a complete and total crash, a blue screen of death for an entire universe. Then I saw it. Tucked into an alcove near the base of the floating, dying crystal was a small, lead-lined box I hadn't noticed before. It was old, clearly Alistair's work, its surface covered in glyphs that I now recognized as shielding protocols, designed to protect its contents from informational corruption. With the last of my strength, I scrambled to it and pried open the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 things. The first was a device, a small cylindrical object made of the same smoky material as the crystal, with a complex, silver-milled key at one end. It hummed with a faint, contained energy. The second was a single folded sheet of paper, a handwritten note from Alistair, his final message. I unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blotted, as if written in a great hurry or under great duress. Leo, if you are reading this, the cascade has begun. I'm sorry. I held it back for as long as I could. There is no time for explanations, only for a choice. The device in this box is the key to the system's root command structure. It is a final, desperate protocol. I call it the hot reboot. Inserting this key into the primary control socket at the base of the crystal will initiate a forced, system-wide restart. It will purge the corruption. It will repair the core logic of the stabilizer from a saved state. It will seal the fracture. It will sever the connection to the observers and push them back beyond the firewall. It will restore the simulation to its last stable version. It will, in essence, save everything. But there is a cost, a terrible, incalculable cost. A system reboot of this magnitude, initiated from within the simulation itself, is not a subtle event. It will create a burst of structured, coherent energy of an unimaginable scale. To the things outside, to the observers and whatever else might be listening in the void, it will be the equivalent of a single, perfect, impossibly loud shout in a silent library. It will be a lighthouse in an infinite, dark ocean. They found us because our system was weak and leaking. If you do this, they will find us because our system is strong and alive. We will trade the quiet, certain death of a system crash for the loud, uncertain horror of being discovered. The choice is yours. A final, merciful end in the dark, or a new beginning under a spotlight on a stage surrounded by things we cannot comprehend. I could not bring myself to make it. Forgive me. Alistair, I looked from the note to the dying crystal, then to the key in my hand. The choice, the impossible, final choice. To let my entire reality, my fake but only home, dissolve into a quiet, meaningless nothingness, or to hit the reset button and gamble on a future where we would be known quantities to the predators outside. Annihilation or damnation. The static in my head was a screaming crescendo. Through the crystal, the observers were pressing closer. I saw a facet flicker and show me a perfect image of my mother's face, her expression one of profound disappointment. It was a cheap, psychological trick, a rogue program accessing my own memory files to destabilize me. But it was brutally effective. It was the violation that made the choice. My reality may be a lie. My life may be a string of code, but it was mine. My pain was mine. My memories were mine. This beautiful, flawed, dying simulation was our only home. And I would not let these cosmic vandals and tear it apart without a fight. The anger, a pure, white-hot human rage, burned through the layers of nihilism. I would not let them win. With a final desperate roar, I lunged toward the base of the dying crystal. A control socket, glowing with a faint, inviting light, was now visible through the storm of leaking data. I held the key, the device that was both our salvation and our doom. I would save this world, even if it meant showing the monsters exactly where we lived. I plunged the key into the socket. The moment the key made contact with the socket was not marked by a sound, but by the end of it. The deafening, soul-tearing roar of the dying crystal, the shriek of failing physics, the psychic scream of the observers, all of it ceased in an instant of absolute ontological silence. It was not the absence of sound, it was the deletion of the very concept of vibration. Light followed a microsecond later. The violent violet hemorrhaging, the corrupted glow of the facets, my own headlamp's beam, all were devoured by a perfect, hungry darkness that erupted from the key. The crystal did not explode, it imploded, collapsing into a point of infinite density and zero dimension. My consciousness, my very sense of self, was unspooled. I was no longer Leo Finch, a physicist in a cave. I was a collection of disorganized data points, a string of orphaned code in a system undergoing a forced shutdown. The feeling of falling was replaced by the sensation of being disassembled. My memories, my fears, my knowledge, all were unwritten, their logical connections severed. There was no pain. There was no thought. There was only the serene, terrifying peace of non-existence. I was nothing. Then came the blue screen. It was not a literal screen, but my returning consciousness perceived it as such. A field of pure, depthless, informational blue filled the void where the universe had been. And against this field, the boot sequence began. Root. Initiating hot reboot protocol. Kernel. Purging memory. Cache. Complete. Kernel. Defragmenting space-time continuum. Complete. Kernel. Verifying core physical constants. C299 792 1458 ms. Verified. G6174 cells 1011 nmkg. 2. Verified. Kaisti 62607015 Gex 10 Hada 34 Jakes. Verified. Colonel. Repairing local stabilizer fracture from V138 Beta Archive. Complete. Colonel. Rebuilding geometric field. Complete. Colonel. Flushing external I/O ports. Securing firewall. Complete. System. Reboot complete. Loading simulation V139. Lines of pure white code, the source of all existence, scrolled past my disembodied awareness. I was witnessing the recompiling of reality. The fundamental laws I had spent my life studying were reinstantiated not as discoveries, but as commands. It was the most profound and humbling moment of my existence to be a conscious witness to my own creation. My senses returned with a sudden, violent snap. I was on the floor of the cavern, gasping, my lungs burning as if I had just taken my first breath. The air was clean, cool, and carried no metallic tang. The oppressive, skull-crushing pressure was gone. The silence remained, but it was a different kind now. It was a clean, healthy silence, the silence of a perfectly running machine. I pushed myself up, my limbs feeling heavy and strange, as if they had just been reattached. I looked at the center of the chamber. The crystal was whole. It floated in the exact center of the cavern, a perfect, multifaceted sphere of smoky quartz. There was no fracture, no leaking light, no corrupted equations. The glyphs carved into its surface glowed with a soft, steady cerulean light. It pulsed gently with a calm, stable 7.83 Hz rhythm. It was no longer a dying god. It was a sleeping one. The device, the key, was gone, having seemingly been absorbed into the crystal itself during the reboot. The cave's geometry was stable. My headlamp cast a single, straight, unwavering beam. The world was healed. A feeling I hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime washed over me. Relief. A profound, bone-deep, soul-saturating relief that almost brought me to my knees. I had done it. Against all odds, against horrors that transcended comprehension, I had won. I had saved everything. I stumbled out of the cave, back into the world. The sight that greeted me was one of divine, impossible beauty. The sky was a flawless, seamless azure, the platonic ideal of blue. The sun's light was warm and clean, no longer oily or distorted. The trees stood straight and tall, their leaves a vibrant, perfect green. The very air seemed to hum with a newfound stability. I took a deep breath, and it tasted of pine and cold stone and pure geometry. I made my way back down the ridge, and the world's perfection was almost unnerving. There were no glitches, no flickers, no causality violations. The bird song was a complex and beautiful symphony, no longer a broken loop. The physics of the world had been restored to their factory settings. Back in the cabin, the oppressive atmosphere was gone. It was just a cabin again, a dusty, silent structure of wood and stone. I went to my equipment, my hands trembling. I powered on my spectrum analyzer and tuned it to the cosmic microwave background frequency. The signal that appeared on my screen was perfect. A smooth, beautiful, random distribution of energy. No holes, no artifacts. The primordial echo of our creation was clean. I checked my environmental sensor. The stream's temperature was a stable 4.7 degrees Celsius. Every law was in its place. Every constant was constant. I had won. Alistair had lost a 40-year war, and I had won it in a single desperate act. As dusk began to settle, I dragged a chair outside, a profound exhaustion settling over me. I wanted to see the stars. I wanted to look up at the restored cosmos, at the clean, uncorrupted heavens, and know that it was safe. The sky bled from blue to orange to a deep, velvety indigo. The first star appeared, Polaris, a comforting, steady presence, then Vega, then the whole magnificent sweep of the Milky Way, a river of diamond dust across the perfect darkness. It was more beautiful than I had ever seen it, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of pride, of triumph. That's when I saw it. It was in the constellation of Cygnus, a small patch of the sky. It wasn't that the stars were dim, it was that they were gone. A circle of perfect, featureless, absolute black. It was not the black of the space between stars. It was a different, deeper black. A black that did not belong. It was a hole in the sky. An absence, a negation. I stared, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. Alistair's final warning, the price of my victory, screamed in the forefront of my mind. A lighthouse in an infinite, dark ocean. As I watched, the patch of blackness grew. It was not fast. It was a slow, deliberate, inexorable expansion. A neighboring star, Deneb, flickered at the edge of the encroaching void. It did not explode. It did not fade. It simply went out. It was de-rendered from existence, wiped from the sky. The darkness, the stain, had consumed it. The reboot had worked. It had healed the simulation. It had sealed the walls and thrown the observers out. But it had also, in that single brilliant flash of restored order, announced our precise location to everything that lurked in the void. It had rung the dinner bell for the cosmos. They were no longer picking at the scraps leaking through the cracks. They were coming. They were not flying ships or traversing space. They were simply unmaking it as they came, deleting the intervening distance between their reality and ours. The spreading darkness was the shadow of their approach, a wave of pure nullity that was methodically erasing the sky. My victory was a sham. My salvation was the most profound damnation imaginable. I had not saved us from a quick, chaotic death. I had condemned us to a slow, meticulously observed one. We were no longer a forgotten program glitching out in a dark corner of the server. We were now the most interesting file on the system, and the new administrators were coming to see what was inside. I stumbled back into the cabin, my body shaking with a terror far deeper than anything I had felt before. The silence of the restored world was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of prey that has just heard the snap of a twig. My gaze fell upon a heavy, rusted pry bar leaning against the fireplace. I picked it up. Its weight was real, solid, a product of the very laws I had just doomed. My role was clear now. Alistair was not a soldier. He was a zookeeper, trying to keep the sounds of his exhibit from disturbing the things that lived outside the walls. I was not a hero. I was the fool who had set off the fireworks. I walked to the main wall of the cabin, the thick, ancient logs that had stood for a century. I had to leave a record. I had to codify the new reality. There had been rules to manage the decay. Now there had to be a rule to manage the observation. With a strength born of pure, absolute despair, I began to carve. The sharp end of the pry bar bit deep into the wood, gouging out the letters one by one. It was the only act left to me, the final, desperate protocol of a species that had just been found. My testament, my warning, and my eternal curse. I carved the final rule. The only rule that mattered now. 7. Pretend we are not here. I dropped the pry bar to the floor with a heavy thud. I extinguished the lantern. I stood in the absolute darkness of the cabin, my prison, my post. My senses were strained, listening, not to the wind or the trees or the sounds of the night. I was listening to the silence, the vast, cosmic, and now rapidly approaching silence, waiting for the moment when the stars were all gone and they would finally gently open the door.